Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to this next episode, which is going to be a very contentious one, not like the other ones haven't been contentious. Today we're going to be talking about a series of different gender issues, and this constitutes, I would say, the bulk of misconceptions about Islam. Much of the misconceptions of Islam have got to do with gender. Why is it that the husband has certain rights in Islam? Why is it that a man can marry more than one wife in Islam? Why is it that inheritance is differentiated? Whatever it may be. These are the kinds of questions that we get. So what we're going to be doing in this is we're going to be looking at some of the modern research on gender difference. That's going to be the first part of this discussion. Because, quite frankly, a lot of the reason why people are even asking these questions is not just because of feminist ideology, but is because these significant gender differences between males and females have simply been underemphasized, intentionally underemphasized. So you'll find that even in primary socialization, parents will tell their children, you can for every daughter they'll say to them, you can do whatever the son can do. These kinds of notions, which are false notions. It's not true. It's not even research based. These kinds of attitudes, slogans, and notions have been put into the public imagination for many decades now. And so one easy way to kind of combat this is to look at the research itself. So we're going to be looking at research today. We're going to be looking at different types of research: scientific research, psychological research, and other types of research. And with that information, the group here is going to attempt to answer these questions themselves. In other words, I'm going to be giving you the information, the flesh or the clay, and then you're going to sculpt your own argument with it. That's going to be the basic structure of today's proceedings. We're going to start with research, and then we're going to go into the most contentious topics relating to gender in Islam, polygyny being one of them, inheritance being another, divorce being a third, and then qawwama being a fourth. I think these four cover the most ground. So we'll start with differences. As you can see in the first slide, we've covered some of this before in previous sessions, but let's just simply state the facts. Number one, scientifically speaking, women have anything between 1/10 to 1/20th the amount of testosterone in their bodies as men do. Now, testosterone is a very important hormone. Both men and women have testosterone. It's a very important hormone. It increases one's strength, it increases aggressivity, it makes one sometimes more assertive, and it has different functions. But it's banned in sports for a very good reason. It's because it gives participants an unfair advantage. It would be almost impossible or absurd to postulate that testosterone has no function in the body, and who cares if men have more testosterone than female women. It's as if to argue, well, let's put 13-year-olds and 17-year-olds, or 10-year-olds and 13, 14-year-olds in a competitive environment. One of the main things which would make such an environment unequal is that in the case of the higher teens, they are more likely to have gone through more transformative puberty. So obviously this is something which is very clear. Men have more testosterone in their bodies than women. Okay, I'm sure everyone here knew that already. But below you can see some of the studies that make that clear. But it's not just testosterone, it's not just anatomy, it's not just the size of your bones, bone structure, and all these kind of things. More, I would say, controversially, it's also cognitive differences. Now, this is where it becomes really controversial, and some feminists do have a knee-jerk reaction to this. What do we mean by cognition? What is cognition? Cognition is thinking, yeah? So, if we say there are cognitive differences, we're saying men think differently to women. Now, Diane Hepburn, who, by the way, this is a very interesting story, she herself was a feminist, and she, in her study, she mentions that she was going to prove that the cognitive differences, like she had an intention to prove that the cognitive differences between men and women were not that sizable. And then when she started doing her investigation, she realized the opposite. She realized that there are actual cognitive differences, and she refers to them as a sizable difference. And the reason why I like to bring, one word phrases is because you can remember it in discussions. For example, if I was formulating this, someone was saying whatever they're saying, say, look, even men and women have differences in cognition, and even feminists like Diane Halpern, who formulated this, stated, and I quote, that there are sizable differences.
What's her name, Diane?
It's on the PowerPoint. It's all on the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
It's all on the PowerPoint. Yeah. So because otherwise it's going to be, it's all there. And interestingly, in 2014, there was a similar study that was done, which found that these cognitive differences were accentuated at the time of menstruation. Interesting. In other words, when women are menstruating, they're less likely to perform well cognitively in tasks, whether logical tasks or otherwise. It's all in the data here. Once again, someone can disagree. This is another one which we've mentioned before in this class. I think is a very important one that you should have. The Baumeister and Cantonese 2001 study, which shows that sexual differences between men and women. Let me just read the abstract. The sex drive refers to the strength of sexual motivation across many different studies and measures. Men have been shown to have more frequent and more intense sexual desires than women, as reflected in spontaneous thoughts about sex, frequency and variety of sexual fantasies, desired frequency of intercourse, desired number of partners, masturbation, liking for various sexual practices, willingness to forego sex, initiating versus refusing sex, etc. Okay. The next one is an interesting study. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of this. It's actually been repeated on social media experiments. And these, like YouTubers have done it. You might have seen these videos, but this was actually a staple, very important study that was done in 1989 by Hatfield. I think her name is Elaine Hatfield, her first name, Elaine Hatfield, in 1989. So this is what they've done. They went into these college campuses and they asked them questions. So it's undercover, right? The men would go to the women and they'd ask them 3 questions. These are the 3 questions they would ask. Would you go out with me tonight? Yeah, number 1. Number 2, would you come over to my apartment tonight? Okay, now you know where this is going. The third question is, would you go to bed with me tonight? Okay, so men would go to women and ask them those 3 questions, and women would go to men and ask them those 3 questions. Now, let me tell you the results. So men, when men asked women, the date option, 56% of women responded, yeah, I'll date you, no problem. It's a good looking man like me, of course I'm going to say yes.
I'm sure I was in the experiment.
6% of women said, to the apartment question, replied yes. Would you go to the apartment? Because it's not saying I want to have intercourse, go to the apartment. And 0%, a staggering 0% said no to the sex question. Do you want to go to bed with me tonight? 0%. Now look at this with the men, flip it on the men. And this is a very famous study in 1989. This is one they use all the time in psychology. When females ask men, 50% of men, listen, it's less men, so when they said date, less men said yes to the women. I don't know why. Maybe they thought it's boring. Maybe they thought I'm not going to get anything out of this. Maybe they thought I was, whatever they thought. As for, do you want to go back to the apartment? 69% said yes. Compared to 6% of women. That's a huge difference. And listen to this. When they said you want to come to bed with me, 0% of women, 75% of men said yes. 75% of men said yes.
But that's interesting. You know why?
Yes,
because
please.
it shows that, for example, that is actually very interesting. You know why? Because it even answers the question that when they asked them about would you date me, what did the men say?
50% said yes.
50% said yes, yeah.
Yeah, which is less than women.
Which was less than women, yeah?
Yeah.
But it's very interesting because it shows that men tend to just want to skip past dating in an apartment and go straight to the bedroom.
Exactly. That's exactly.
So even
that's
answer the first question of them being low.
That's the conclusion. The conclusion is that men are not really interested in relationships as much as women are, but women are not as much interested in casual sex. They call it casual sex as much as men are. That's a fact. Now, some will say, well, how comes you're quoting a study from 1989? I mean, this is 32 years ago. It's because ethics committees don't allow this to happen now. You can't do this now. If you guys have gone to, most of you have gone to university or you've seen studies and so on before. Nowadays, everything you want to do, if you want to do a field experiment, you have to do something in ethics. You have to fill out an ethics form. Yeah, I don't know what they got, the CUREC and this and that. I don't know what they call. Can't remember their names now. But now you can't. If you try to put this through an ethics committee, they'll say no. In the West, this is like, imagine going and saying you want to have sex. It's sexual harassment. They also say Me Too movement. Imagine that. Honestly, if you think about it, they'll never allow this now. That's why it's been repeated again, but it's only been repeated by YouTubers. Can you see? Stereotypes about men and women are true to some extent. I mean, stereotypes are sometimes true. This word stereotypes, when I was younger, I don't know about you guys, but they made it seem as if stereotyping people in general was the worst thing in the world. And generalizing, when you get into like social sciences, they say just, everyone's trying to avoid generalization. However, if you try and eliminate all kinds of generalizations and continuities, then you find it hard to say anything about anything. And so there are some traits which are collective and continuous throughout peoples, and we are seeing these traits between men and women. The next thing, order of business, which I'm sure many of us have spoken about, maybe not on camera, or that have or conversations have been had, about hypergamy. Now, hypergamy is basically the fact that women will marry up. What do we mean by marry up? We have to define that, and we will define that in more clear detail. It could be economic resource. It could be that the status or whatever. It could be, there's many different ways of understanding it. And it's true that happens. It is true that happens. But it's not as true as many in the red pill community make it out to be. And it's not the only defining thing. Because nowadays we're finding in the red pill community, hypergamy is like the all-defining, it is the all-explaining thing. Yani, we can't have a one size-fits-all policy with this. So you have to be careful. There is strong evidence for it. In fact, the most quoted and cited study is by this person called Kian. Yeah? Yeah, I'll read some things out from what they've said. Okay, this is the most cited study that I've seen about hypergamy.
What's the name of the study?
It's there on it's on the PowerPoint. Are you not on the PowerPoint or what?
I am. I just want.
Yeah, it's there on the PowerPoint. It's there, people can see at home. You guys can see it. It's all there. Right? I've done it on reason. I made a PowerPoint on purpose because I knew this is too much information. This is what they conclude. Between 1980 and 2008 to 2012, educational sorts of mating reversed from a tendency. This is something interesting, and this point here I took out on purpose, because this shows that hypergamy is working in reverse when it comes to education. So although women marry, it's true that women marry men that are more rich than they are. Yeah, that's true. It's true cross-culturally as well, by the way. Like when women are making a decision of who to marry, they will marry someone who's got resources. That's a true statement. And some I don't know where they are. I've seen some quotations like hypergamy states that, and this is obviously like exaggeration, but a woman would rather be the 10th wife of a king than a first wife of a pauper. Do you see? Yeah, it's true. I mean, to some extent, yeah.
Have you defined hypergamy? How are you defining it?
So hypergamy can be defined in, so what you would say is educational hypergamy. For example, if we're talking about me.
No, I'm saying, so like when you talk about it, would you always qualify it as educational hypergamy?
I think you should.
Hypergamy?
I think we should because the studies have shown, although economic hypergamy there's a continuous trend upwards, educational hypergamy from 2008 to 2012 we've seen has gone down. So in other words, a woman doesn't care as much as she used to in the last 4 years in the West, let me be very specific, if the husband has less education than her. Like for example, if she's got a master's degree and if she's got a master's and he has got a degree, for example, or she's got a degree and he has no degree. So before that would have counted for a lot more, but so long as he's got money, she doesn't really care about that as much.
So now that's happening. You're saying now.
Yeah, what I'm saying now is in the last 4 years, in the last four or 5 years,
They care less about that.
they care less about educational status.
Interesting.
You can hazard a guess. I don't know why that's happening in the West. Maybe it's because people realize that qualifications don't get you money. Maybe it's all to do with that. It's as simple as that.
I think that makes perfect
You know,
sense.
maybe it's because of another reason. Maybe it's because she realizes that it's, you know, you can come out with a million reasons, but hypergamy is not one thing. And we know there's something called homogamy as well. Homogamy is, it's not just a case that women want to marry someone who's richer than them, for the most part, and obviously it's no, but it's also the case that, and homogamy can be sometimes even more powerful than hypergamy. Women want to marry someone from their own bracket, from their own community. For example, black women like to marry black men, for the most part. You see sometimes, I mean, you've seen in London, how many times, we see the opposite a lot of times, like black men with white women.
Yeah.
But black women like to go for black men. Asian women like to go for Asian men. Arab women like to go for Arab men. White women like to go for white men. That is a fact. That statistically, that's true. And sometimes that's encouraged by a range of societal, cultural, and tribal reasons. Sometimes you're not even allowed to marry outside of you know, so honestly. And as we know, in the Muslim world, that's the case. We have some people that, you know, that would, and then you have racism. So you have, sometimes you have racism within a community, which can be overt or covert, which would actually not allow certain people to marry, like, you know, my daughter's not going to marry a black boy or something like that, you know, or if she's not from my tribe, then no chance. We have to preserve the lineage, we have to preserve the language, or whatever. Sometimes, you know, the language arguments are not that bad. I mean, it's not completely un-Islamic. Say, oh, I want someone this language. I'm not saying that no one can have these, whatever, but when the racial element is something we have to work out in the community as well. But that is, all of these reasons are reasons why homogamy actually is a very powerful thing. Now, people talk about hypergamy, and especially when they try and bring red pill and stuff into the Islamic discourse, the problem is that Muslim women are not even allowed to marry Christian men and Jewish men and atheist men. Okay, which means that if an atheist man with £1 million a month that he's getting comes and proposes to a Muslim woman, and a Muslim man who's earning 40 grand a year proposes to the same Muslim, then she's going to choose the Muslim man, for the most part. I'm not saying there will not be people in the community who will sell whatever they have of honor in order to, or religion.
Or get him to accept Islam.
Yeah, but for the most part, it's you know, let's assume that that's not happening. Let's assume that he's an atheist and he's happy with his religion.
Yeah.
You see, a lot of women will say, I can't. Believe you me, they will say I can't. I believe women are probably more likely to say I can't, based on the evidence that we've just seen, than men are. You'll be very surprised. Women are very, very, like, you know, when it comes to these things in the Muslim community, have shown to be very consistent within their own Muslim framework. We don't really see that many Muslim women going with Christian men. You probably can count the number on your fingertips, for example, or with atheist men. We don't see it. So homogamy in the Muslim community is probably more of a defining thing than hypergamy is. However, obviously within the pool of Muslim people, you see, obviously if a woman is presented with two individuals, one of them is very rich, one of them is very poor, then we know where, I mean, unless she's very attracted to the poor guy, the rich guy. Or there are sub-communities within the Muslim world, cults and so on, which is why cults are very powerful. The Madkhalite cult, or you know, the Brelvite cult or something. No, honestly, they will stick within their own despite the incentive to do otherwise, because they have to be on my manhaj. You know, they have to follow my mashayikh. That's why this is the incentive of being in a cult, by the way. Which is why we have to create one. Yeah. So check that out. I want to
Can call it that.
I don't know. Cults are huge. Yeah. Anyway, hypergamy.
Guys, you want to eat your food now or later?
Let's just finish this first part here.
Just let you know, because it's getting cold. It's your food.
Oh yeah, that's right. No one's fasting today, right? No one. Is anyone fasting?
Okay, if anyone's
All right. Let's have a pause here then, guys. No. Let's pause here.
Carry on if they get their food out the box. It won't have the.
Let's pause here. Trust me.
Okay.
Let him have his
Okay, guys.
thing. And there's a lot to talk about as a group anyway. So we're going to pause here, guys, because there's a lot to talk about here as a group. We're going to see what the relevance of this information is to what we're going to be speaking about next, and the significance of this information. Right. So we just had our discussions, and the idea is that when we're going through these research, different research material, that we're realizing that the extent of the differences between men and women, the questions that us Muslims receive in regards to some differentiation of the injunctions between men and women, you start to realize that in fact these questions are quite absurd from the first instance. Because why is it that we have to justify ourselves that there are some things in Islam that cater for a woman's need, some things in Islam which cater for a man's need? The Islamic laws cater for the differences, but if the differences are not emphasized, then the Islamic laws don't seem coherent. So simply by emphasizing the differences, one sees the immediate wisdom in the Islamic laws. One such law is the premarital law of zina, or hurma, prohibition of zina, or having intercourse outside of marriage. And in addition to the diseases one may pick up from doing that kind of thing, which we're seeing at a very high rate in the West, there's actual evidence now as well to show that premarital sex actually increases your rate of divorce. It's good evidence for that. I've shown some references there. If, therefore, one doesn't want to have divorce in a community, then it makes sense to avoid premarital sex. Why is it? I've seen different analyses as to why people say that that is the case. Some invoke comparison, say, well, because if you have had many sexual especially if a woman has, by the way, I mean, it's totally exacerbated with a woman. She's had many sexual partners, then she's less likely to be satisfied, or she's less likely to be happy in a marriage. Or it could be that having many sexual partners increases your apathetic attitude towards human beings in general. Whatever it may be, we can't really speculate here. It is the case, there is a correlation between premarital sex and increased instability in a marriage. Well, of course, we've spoken about sex for a very long time, and that's not all that there is to a relationship. Something which is equally, if not much more important than sex, is love itself. And in fact, you'd be surprised, because you'd think that women fall in love stronger and all these kind of things. But evidence shows that there's moderate differences between men and women when it comes to love. So when it comes to love, men and women are the evidence shows that they're pretty similar. So a love for a man is not any weaker than a love for a woman. This is, I think, one of the misconceptions then. If the research shows that, because we tend to think that since men are the more sexual, and when I say the more sexual, I mean in the ways that the research has indicated already. Frequency, the want for variety, sexual variety is a huge thing. Men interested in more different sexual images and so on. That therefore, that must come at the expense of not being as loving or able to love, but that's not true. Because the research has shown us that actually both love very similarly, in fact, in terms of intensity. And some scholars, some psychologists, psychology experts, and biologists, physiologists, like to separate the different systems. Even anthropologists, I read with Helen Fisher, she did the same thing. She's an expert in love. So they tend to separate it into dopamine systems, serotonin systems and testosterone systems, sometimes oxytocin systems. So they say really what they do is that you've got different systems in your body. You've got the dopamine system, and sometimes they put dopamine and the oxytocin together. Then you have, your testosterone system and your serotonin system. So the testosterone system, although sexually, it's not just testosterone that is required in order to create arousal or to increase the libido for man or woman. Although there is evidence, by the way, I've seen, that shows that if a woman increases her testosterone, she's more likely to increase her libido. Very interesting. However, there is a point of diminishing returns, as steroid users will know very much. So, for example, taking TRT, testosterone replacement therapy, may increase your libido, but if you take Trenbolone or human growth hormone, that may actually have an adverse effect on a man. On a woman, I don't know if any studies have been done, but that's in the industry. This is kind of well known. Like, with one of the side effects of heavy dose steroid use is a reversal of sexual libido. So there's a point where diminishing returns. But the reason why I'm telling you that is because you've got this system, which is the testosterone system. Then you have the dopamine system and or the oxytocin system. And when you have intercourse, actually, your body secretes oxytocin, men and women, which increases the likelihood of pair bonding and love being connected. So the more you have intercourse with someone, the more likely you are to be in love with them. And many men know that, by the way, from experience, which is why they choose the casual sex option, which means that the oxytocin doesn't build up. They can continue just releasing the testosterone, and not have the impact of, being in love and then heartbreak and all this kind of thing. You don't have to deal with that. If you're in a short-term non-committal relationship, just have intercourse. They call it lash and dash or hit and run, or I don't know. What do they call it nowadays? Huh? Beat and delete. Astaghfirullah. But that's why Islam is so powerful, because it stops this kind of things by allowing the man to have responsibilities. If you want to get into a relationship, you have these rights that you owe the woman, and it's a responsibility. And some will say, well, what about this idea of arranged marriages? And then there's almost an attack on the idea that, Islam doesn't say you have to be in an arranged marriage. Obviously, some people that want to get married, they'll go to depends on the community, the culture. I mean, every single Muslim community and culture is not the same. If they live in, I don't know, you guys know more than I do. If you're subcontinental Bengali or Pakistani, I don't know, the cousins will get together and I don't know what they do. Or they come together and say, this one is for me, or this one, or they go to the mother or whatever. Sometimes they do that in Egypt as well, but they'll find them in the school or something. It doesn't have to be arranged, but it is a common practice nowadays. They're using apps, stuff like that, But I remember having a conversation with one of my friends before, when I was working in a place, and he was talking. He was like almost in a pseudo manner, mocking the idea of his arranged marriage. And I was sitting with him on the train. And I looked up, and there was an advert for a company called Match. I said, his name was Jamie. I said, brother, Jamie, you're talking about arranged marriage. Do you want to know what arranged marriage is? I said, look at that advert over there. Mm-hmm. I said, they're arranging marriages. So you put in your criterion, they put in their criterion, and the algorithm arranges the marriage. The only difference between, the Islamic system and that system is that you got a human being doing it, or you got an algorithm doing it. It's an arranged marriage. Anyway, the idea, there's actually a study done on arranged marriage. Robert Epstein and Mansky Thakkar. Okay. And it showed that love, in most cases, actually increased after a marriage, even if the person didn't love them before. It's a very important study, that in arranged marriages, that you might not love the person in the beginning of the marriage, but I think 70 to 90%, I can't remember exactly the numbers, but I can go on it. 70 to 90% of people then met, so you don't start off loving the person. which is an interesting thing, especially when Muslims are looking for marriage. They think, I don't like them, I don't love them. And that can actually even put them off being married. Whereas the evidence shows that you don't need to start loving them, because most people who don't love their spouses will end up doing so. Most people, the vast majority.
But they probably do that because the thing is, when they get into relationships, the expectation is love first. So to them, their their brain has registered as it begins with love, but it actually ends with love.
Yeah,
so the perception is wrong, and the expectation is.
It's basically because and you know, it's interesting because even though these guys are not, like, one of them is definitely not even Robert Epstein. He was consistently, I remember reading this, he was consistently making comparisons between the Western system of relationships versus this arranged marriage system. And a lot of people have just become, the thing is, they're just following the Western system of relationships. So if they're not going to get what their Western counterpart is going to get from a relationship, then they feel like they're missing out in life. But the truth is, the honest truth is that the Western system is actually a failure, because it doesn't guarantee any rights for the people in a committed relationship. So, for example, you have a man and a woman in a 2-year, 3-year relationship. There's no marriage going on, and there is no firm commitment either way. There's no accountability either way, and there's actually probably a higher chance of heartbreak, because in a marriage there's a much higher chance, because in a marriage there's a societal consequence for being divorced. So
that financial.
there's financial issues, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a huge disincentive to. So the Western system increases the chance of heartbreak. But they'll say, you're talking about heartbreak, and you're talking about polygyny. And I was actually scouring the internet and the databases and stuff for information about polygyny. Not in that manner, I mean. Information about, like, the studies and so on. And there's a bit of a controversy, because the question that the Western man has decided to ask is whether, this is where we start, whether or not polygyny is harmful. So it's a defensive stance. And obviously polygyny is actually, I think, most practiced in sub-Saharan Africa. People have this misconception that it's practiced mostly in, like, I don't know, Saudi Arabia, Qatar or something. It's not. That's false. Qatari women, go and speak to a native Qatari woman about polygyny, and compare her with a Nigerian woman. When I was in Nigeria recently, there were Christians in fully fledged polygynous relationship. It's so much so that there's a Netflix show they actually put up recently.
Really?
Yeah, it's a comedy movie or something, a Nigerian one.
What's it called?
It's called Captain something. I don't know what it's called. It's a Nigerian one. It's a Nigerian movie. But you know what it's about? It's about this Nigerian guy who died. Daddy, something Daddy, I don't know what his name is. And he died, and he left behind, he's a rich man. And, like, all his wives now, like, didn't know about each other, innit? Okay. And they finally find out about each other, and they're all mad and wild, and they're trying to split the inheritance and all those kind of things. But he's a Christian man. And I was surprised, to find in Nigeria that you could even say that polygyny is not just an Islamic practice. You could say it's a Nigerian practice.
So what are the women angry about? The fact that he has another wife, or the fact that they're going to share his inheritance?
Well, you can watch the movie. I haven't. maybe a bit of both. It depends on what woman it was, I guess. You know.
I'm sure.
Yeah. But you see the point. The point is that first of all, we have a misconception as who's practicing this thing in the first place. So the reason why I mentioned Africa is because actually the most studies that I've seen have been in Africa. And so the one I've put here is about in Tanzania. And the conclusion, interestingly, is that it's not harmful. No evidence that polygynous marriage is harmful in northern Tanzania. When we say harm here, we're talking about all types of harm, and they talk about all types of harm in that study. But in particular, they look at, like, why it's done in the first place, like why there's a necessity for it, or there may be a necessity for it, why some tribes do it. Another way of assessing the differences in men and women is through what is referred to as the Big Five personality traits. This is quite big in psychology. The Big Five personality traits, things like agreeableness, trait conscientiousness, neuroticism, and so on. Agreeableness, as it says on the tin, is like how much do you agree or disagree with someone. if you agree with someone all the time trying to avoid conflict, that can sometimes be a negative thing, basically. Especially in the world of negotiating and business. Well, if you're conflict averse, basically, it can create problems. And so when they did this kind of cross-cultural studies on the big 5 personality traits, neuroticism is the idea that how much negative feelings do you have? How negative, like for example, how likely are you to report that you've had a negative, like right now I feel depressed, I feel sad, I feel this, I feel that. Like you're just living a day-to-day existence and you report the existence of negative feelings like anxiety or depression or sadness or whatever. When they looked at all of these things, they found that there are trends, which even cross-cultural trends between men and women, which are different. So with men, for example, they are more disagreeable than women, and they are less neurotic. Conscientiousness is how much do you consider your own action. Trait conscientiousness, and so the idea is that the conclusions of these studies is that gender differences. I'll read the conclusion. In fact, this is one of the biggest studies I've done. I've seen gender differences in personality across 10 aspects of the big 5. By examining personality at the level of 10 aspects of the big 5, we demonstrated that gender differences in personality traits are even more pervasive than typically been reported. So they will probably go into to see. Hopefully, maybe we'll minimize the damage. They came and they found that there's even more differences than they thought before. And I've put here, in addition to that, some more studies. For example, this study, which is a big study, 2001, by Paul Costa and Robert McRae, which involved 23,000 individuals. It's a huge study. Yeah, 23,000 men and women from 26 countries, and they filled out personality questions. Yeah. And women consistently rated themselves as being warmer, friendlier, and more anxious and sensitive to their feelings than did men. There are differences between men and women, right? The men were, meanwhile, consistently rated personality psychology. The women has scored higher on average on agreeableness and neuroticism and the facet of openness to experience, while men scored higher on one facet of extroversion and a different facet of openness to experience. And there was another study in 2008 with the same kind of thing. And I've put some other points there. Some other kind of criticisms and other studies there as well. And this happens with children and all the way through to adults. So these are just some of the studies you have to your disposal. And I want everyone to think about these studies that we spoke about today. And in the next discussion that we do have, we will now, using this information, make our own arguments on the questions related to polygyny or female testimony, 2-to-1 ratio, this kind of things we hear, or what's the other one? Why man can divorce with the difference in divorce between man and woman, and these things we hear. Now that you have this information, which is the most modern information that we have, we can do that. And obviously, I would say one more thing is that if you do find any other studies which are important, or indeed if you guys do at home as well, then please comment below to let us know of something which is very important studies, very important research that we can use in our argumentation. With that, we conclude. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.